Between 1962 and 1964, the city of Boston was gripped by a suffocating fear. Women triple-checked their locks. Neighbors listened for any unusual sound in the night. And a single terrifying name began to dominate the headlines: the Boston Strangler. This wasn't just a murderer. This was a mystery that would shatter public trust, push law enforcement to its absolute limit, and leave behind haunting questions that still echo today. This is the true story of the Boston Strangler. The story begins with a chilling, quiet. On June 14, 1962, 55-year-old Anna Sleezers was discovered dead in her Boston apartment. The scene was disturbing. She had been assaulted and strangled with a cord tied in a strange, neat bow. At first, the police treated it as a tragic but isolated incident. They couldn't have been more wrong. Over the next 2 years, a horrifying pattern emerged. Women across Boston, ranging in age from their early 20s to their late 80s, were found murdered in eerily similar circumstances. They were strangled, often with their own stockings. They were frequently assaulted. And, in a macabre signature, their bodies were often posed afterward. The pattern was undeniable and terrifying. Boston was facing a serial killer. A city that once felt safe was now under siege. Fear spread like a virus. The killer didn't break down doors or shatter windows. He simply knocked. Victims, often older women living alone, were last seen letting someone into their homes, a person they trusted, or at least didn't fear. The strangler seemed to be a phantom, a chameleon who could blend in effortlessly. No forced entry. No reliable witnesses. No clear description. Life in Boston changed dramatically. Women began traveling in groups, never walking alone after dark. Businesses that once stayed open late started closing their doors early. Self-defense classes filled up overnight. The city's sense of security was gone, replaced by a constant, low-level hum of anxiety. Boston had never experienced terror on this scale before. The police were overwhelmed. They formed a massive task force, pulling in detectives from across the state. They conducted thousands of interviews and questioned hundreds of potential suspects, in a move that was still relatively new for law enforcement. They brought in psychiatrists to develop psychological profiles of the killer. Who was this man who could be so charming one moment and so monstrous the next? The media, of course, fueled the public panic. Every new murder became front-page news, splashing gruesome details across every breakfast table in the city. The headlines screamed for justice and put immense pressure on the investigation. With every woman found dead, the public outrage grew louder. And still, there was no arrest. There was no arrest. The killer remained a ghost. Then, just as suddenly as they began, the murders stopped. After the final victim was discovered in January 1964, the city waited. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. But there were no more victims, no more strange bows, no more of the Strangler's calling cards. The reign of terror was over. But there was no explanation. No capture. Just a deafening, unnerving silence. A year later, in 1965, the case took a shocking turn. A man named Albert DeSalvo was arrested, but not for murder. He was apprehended for a completely separate series of crimes. A string of sexual assaults where he was known as the Green Man or the Measuring Man. He would talk his way into women's apartments, sometimes pretending to be a talent scout, and then tie them up. While he was in custody for these crimes, DeSalvo made a stunning claim to his cellmate. He said he was the Boston Strangler. What followed was a series of detailed, chilling confessions. He described the crime scenes, the victims' apartments, their final words, and his methods with an unnerving level of detail that only the killer could know. He seemed to be the answer to the city's prayers and its worst nightmares. But there was a huge problem. Despite the confessions, there was no physical evidence linking Albert DeSalvo to any of the Strangler murders. No fingerprints. No fibers. No DNA, which was a science still decades away. Not a single witness could place him at any of the scenes. Because of this complete lack of corroborating evidence, DeSalvo was never actually tried for the Strangler murders. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison for the unrelated Green Man assaults. The man who claimed to be the Boston Strangler was behind bars, but the case was far from closed. Almost immediately, a storm of doubt and controversy erupted. People began picking apart his confession. Some of the details DeSalvo provided were just plain wrong. He got facts about the crime scenes incorrect. This led many investigators and reporters to believe that he couldn't have been the killer. Some theories suggested he was a pathological liar, seeking fame and notoriety. Others proposed a more calculated motive, by confessing to the murders. He hoped to be declared criminally insane, landing him in a mental hospital instead of a maximum security prison. The debate raged. Was DeSalvo the lone killer? Or was there more than one strangler operating in Boston? With DeSalvo just one piece of a much larger, darker puzzle. The families of the victims were divided. Some found peace, believing justice had finally been served. Others were convinced the real killer, or killers, were still out there, free. Then, in 1973, another violent twist. Albert DeSalvo was found stabbed to death in his cell at Walpole Prison. His murder has never been solved. And with his death, many believed the full truth about the Boston Strangler was buried forever. For decades, the case remained in this state of limbo. DeSalvo was the confessed killer, but without proof, doubt lingered. The story of the Boston Strangler became a modern legend, a cautionary tale about the limits of justice. But then, science caught up with history. In 2013, investigators reopened the case. Armed with technology that was pure science fiction in the 1960s. DNA analysis. They exhumed Albert DeSalvo's body to obtain a DNA sample. They then compared it to evidence preserved from the crime scene of the very last victim, 19-year-old Mary Sullivan. And they found a match. For the first time, there was a direct, physical link between Albert DeSalvo and one of the Boston Strangler murders. It was a groundbreaking moment. For Mary Sullivan's family, it was a form of closure nearly 50 years in the making. But even this scientific breakthrough didn't answer everything. It proved DeSalvo was responsible for at least one of the murders. But what about the other 12 women? Did DeSalvo, a man known for inconsistencies in his confession, really kill all of them? Or was Boston terrorized by more than one man during those 2 terrifying years? Were some of the murders simply misattributed to the Strangler in the midst of the panic? The official narrative remains contested, and the full scope of DeSalvo's guilt is still debated by experts today. The legacy of the Boston Strangler is profound. It forever changed America. It was one of the first major cases to bring criminal profiling into the public consciousness. It forced police departments to rethink how they investigate serial crimes and communicate with a terrified public. And it starkly exposed the limitations of law enforcement in the pre-DNA era. But most importantly, the case left behind victims. 13 women whose lives were stolen, and whose families were left to navigate a world of grief, suspicion, and decades of unanswered questions. For some, the answers are still incomplete. The Boston Strangler isn't just a story about murder. It's a story about fear, and how it can paralyze a city. It's about uncertainty, and the desperate search for answers in the face of unspeakable chaos. It's a story about justice delayed and, for many, a justice that may forever remain incomplete. And it serves as a chilling reminder that even when we give a name to evil, the full, unvarnished truth can remain forever just out of reach. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into history's most compelling mysteries. See you next time.